Hi, we're going to finish our discussion of genetics. In our first video, we discussed the basic concepts in genetics. In the next video, we applied those basic concepts to an important branch of psychology called behavioral genetics. And in this video, we're going to apply the basic concepts in genetics to another important branch of psychology called evolutionary psychology. So if you recall from the last video, behavioral genetics is focused on explaining individual differences among us. It's focused on nature versus nurture. It is not concerned with where those genetic variations came from or why. Okay, so that is the domain of evolutionary psychology. So evolutionary psychology is interested in why does a behavior exist within the gene pool of our species? What does it do for us? What is the function of the behavior or the trait? How does that behavior or trait enhance survival or reproduction? Adaptation means that a behavior or trait enhances survival or reproduction in some way. Natural selection is the idea that if a trait or behavior is adaptive, then it makes us more likely to pass on genes related to that trait to the next generation. And I want to give you an example that does not involve humans. The rest of our examples will involve humans. But in the 1800s, there was a particular type of moth in England, and there was genetic variation. So some moths had light wings, some moths had dark wings, and the trees in that area had light-colored bark. So when the light-winged moths would sit on the light-barked trees, they were camouflaged, more likely to live longer and long enough to reproduce and pass on their light-colored wing genes to the next generation. The dark-colored winged moths were less adapted to the environment. They would sit on the trees and be noticed. They would be targets for the birds, so they were less likely to pass on their genes to the next generation. Then, in a short amount of time, the Industrial Revolution happened, soot covered the trees, and they were now dark. So the dark-colored moths then became more adaptive to this situation because now their dark-colored wings provided camouflage, whereas the light-colored winged moths were now targets for the birds. So in a short amount of time, the species of moths shifted from mostly light-colored in that area to mostly dark-colored in that area. So that is just an example of natural selection. Okay? So when a trait is adaptive, it is more likely to be passed on to the next generation. Individual reproductive fitness means that a particular behavior or trait enhances the survival or reproduction of the individual, whereas inclusive fitness means that a behavior or trait enhances passing on the genes within the family. So for example, I think about prairie dogs popping up and sounding an alarm when a predator is coming. The prairie dog who's sounding the alarm is likely to be eaten by the predator. So that is not an adaptive behavior at an individual level. However, in sounding the alarm, all of the other prairie dogs, who are likely connected genetically to the one sounding the alarm, go underground and they are protected. They're likely to live longer and pass on the genes into future generations. Okay? So sometimes individual behaviors don't seem very adaptive, but sometimes there's this inclusive fitness aspect. So not every trait or behavior has an evolutionary story. Evolutionary psychology does not try to explain everything about who we are. Rather, it tries to provide an additional piece to the bigger story related to relevant traits and behaviors. So, for example, what is the survival or reproductive function of aggression? That one's pretty obvious. Aggression in the history of our species, again, for evolution, always think back to our ancestors. Aggression has provided a means to protect our resources, to protect ourselves and our families, and so forth. What is the survival or reproductive function of language? of facial expressions of emotion, of infant separation anxiety, or of morality. So it's not just aggression, but also the good stuff, the pro-social stuff. What is the survival or reproductive function of these? Okay? Well, if you want to study these different topics, you can't just go into the laboratory the way you can when you're studying different topics from other perspectives. One of the things that you can do is look at cross-cultural universals. So, for example, if you're studying facial expressions of emotion, which we will talk about in a later lesson, then if you're trying to put together an evolutionary story, you need to first establish that there are certain facial expressions that are universal, that are found across cultures all over the world, separate from culture. Now, finding something all over the world doesn't tell you for sure that it's in our genes, but at least it tells you that this particular trait or behavior may be a candidate for an evolutionary explanation. But you have to combine that with other types of methods. So, for example, a cross-species comparison, so looking for similarities in similar species. For example, infant separation anxiety. So when infants are being handed to another person that's not one of their caregivers, they may scream, they may freak out. That is normal. It is adaptive, okay? And this is something that you see in human babies, but you also see in other primates. It's not unique to humans, okay? That serves a survival function. So you look for things across cultures, you look for those traits and behaviors across species, and you look in the brain. For example, identifying areas that are specialized to a function, like language, okay? And you look at babies. So if you're trying to establish that something is built into our genes, one of the places you can go is look at people who have very little experience. And those people are babies. So if you can establish the presence of a particular skill or trait or behavior early on, then that provides evidence that something may be built into our genes because it wasn't just learned. Now, that doesn't mean that there are things in our genes that don't show up later, because they can. But if you do find something in early infancy, that suggests that there may be a genetic influence. So I'm going to show you a video clip here of babies. It'll give you a chance to see how to get into baby minds, because you can't just talk to babies. They're really hard to study. So they're going to use looking time and reaching as their operational definitions. And just pay attention to what the babies are revealing through their behavior.
And watch puppet shows.
Up goes the curtain.
And Wynn is part of a new wave of researchers who have discovered seemingly simple ways to probe what's really going on in those adorable little heads.
Up goes the curtain.
We watched as Wynn and her team asked a question that 20 years ago might have gotten her laughed out of her field. Does Wesley here, at the ripe old age of 5 months, know the difference between right and wrong? Wesley watches as the puppet in the center struggles to open up a box with a toy inside. The puppy in the yellow shirt comes over and lends a hand. Then the scene repeats itself, but this time the puppy in the blue shirt comes and slams the box shut. Nice behavior? Mean behavior. At least to our eyes. But is that how a 5-month-old sees it? And does he have a preference?
Leslie, do you remember these guys from the show?
To find out, a researcher who doesn't know which puppet was nice and which was mean offers Wesley a choice.
Who do you like?
He can't answer, but he can reach.
That one.
Wesley chose the good guy, and he wasn't alone.
That one.
More than 3/4 of the babies tested reached for the nice puppet.
That one.
Wynn tried it out on even younger babies, 3-month-olds, who can't control their arms enough to reach. But they can vote with their eyes, since research has shown that even very young babies look longer at things they like.
Which one do you like?
Daisy here looked at the mean puppet for 5 seconds, then switched to the nice one for 33.
Babies, even at 3 months, looked towards the nice character and looked hardly at all, much shorter times, towards the unhelpful character.
So basically, as young as 3 months old, we human beings show a preference for nice people over mean people.
Study after study after study, the results are always consistently babies feeling positively towards helpful individuals in the world and disapproving, disliking, maybe condemning individuals who are antisocial towards others.
It's astonishing. Wynne and her team first published their findings about baby morality in the journal Nature in 2007, and they've continued to publish follow-up studies in other peer-reviewed journals ever since. For instance, on this experiment, they showed babies like James here a puppet behaving badly. Instead of rolling the ball back to the puppet in the middle, this green-shirted bunny keeps the other puppet's ball and runs away. Then James is shown a second show. This time, the bunny, who we just saw steal the ball, tries to open up the box to get the toy. Will James still prefer the puppet who helps out, or will he now prefer the one who slams the box shut?
Who do you like?
He chose the one who slammed it shut, as did 81% of babies tested. The study's conclusion, babies seem to view the ball thief as deserving punishment. So do you think that babies, therefore, are born with an innate sense of justice?
At a very elemental level, I think so.
We think we see here the foundations for morality. There's some way to do the punishment.
Paul Bloom is also a professor of psychology at Yale with his own lab. He's collaborated with Wynne on many of her baby studies, and he also happens to be her husband.
I feel we're making discoveries. I feel like we're discovering that what seems to be one way really isn't. What seems to be an ignorant and unknowing baby is actually a creature with this alarming sophistication, subtle knowledge.
And he says discovering this in babies who can't walk, talk, or even crawl yet suggests it has to come built in. So remember B.F. Skinner, who said that we had to teach our children everything through conditioning. So does this just wipe him off the map?
What we're finding in the baby lab is that there's more to it than that, that there's a universal moral core that all humans share. The seeds of our understanding of justice, our understanding of right and wrong, are part of our biological nature.
Which one do you...
Okay, so you saw some babies being studied. You can't talk to them, so you have to find these creative ways to get into their minds. And so what you saw was the presentation of events and then watching how long the babies looked at specific events and what they reached for. And what the babies were showing was not subtle. Their results are very strong. It wasn't like 51% of babies did something or something like that. All of these studies range between like 80 and 90%. So the babies are trying to tell us something, but we're just not quite sure what it is. So the researchers clearly have a conclusion. They believe that the babies are providing evidence for a genetic moral core, an evolutionary basis to morality. But could they be wrong? Maybe. The babies are telling us something, but could the babies be telling us something different? Well, the researchers have to rule out alternative explanations. Maybe babies like reaching toward the right more than the left. So what do? Sometimes the good puppet is on the right, sometimes the good puppet is on the left. It's not that. Maybe babies prefer one color to another color shirt on the puppet. So what do? You make some babies see the good puppet wearing one color and other babies see the good puppet wearing a different color. It's not color. So far, researchers have not found an alternative explanation. So it may just be that there's some sort of a genetic core for morality.